you see on your chairs, there is an old newsletter, a facsimile newsletter from the Municipal Art Society, which Municipal Art Society will be mentioned a few times this evening, talking about the election of a dynamic young man named Kent Barwick. I believe some of you here know Kent Barwick. On that same newsletter, in the second, on the right-hand column, there's a little thing, and it's got a little blue arrow on it, and it's talking about a meeting that's going to be happening at Bronson Binger's house, that he's going to be talking about proposed Carnegie Hill Historic District. And according to myth, either at that meeting or at the follow-up meeting thereupon was when it was proposed that the Historic Districts Council was to be created as a committee of the Municipal Art Society. This has been handed down to me like some sort of origin myth, Mount Arafat, Joan Davidson's apartment. The whole thing really makes a lot of sense when you put it together. And like the MAS committees of today, the committee of the Historic Districts Council did not consist of MAS board members. There were perhaps some board members who were involved as well, but it was a group of historic districts and wannabe historic districts which were being imagined as a voice for this new emerging constituency. And again, the origin myth goes on to talk about how this council was there to demonstrate to the powers that be that the Landmarks Commission, which was still very much in its infancy, it was only 5 years old at that point, represented actual people in the neighborhood, and that the Landmarks Commission needed more resources to properly serve that constituency, and that the Landmarks Law was something that the people wanted. So that the Municipal Art Society created this group to advocate for more resources for landmarks and to protect the integrity of the Landmarks Law, which is what we still do. So thank you very much. It's been great seeing you. We've grown since then. I've also heard, however, that we were important to the 1972 amendments, one of which was, people know about the creation of scenic landmarks. The interior landmarks are the ones that people always focus on, but what those amendments, the 73 amendments, actually did was they also got rid of the moratorium that the Landmarks Commission was laboring under at the time. If you look at the sort of arc of designations, it's a little sketchy unless you get really deep into it, but basically the commission only was able to hear for 18 months and then had to take 2 or 3 years off, during which time it could act on the things it had heard, but it couldn't hear new things, and it was all as a sort of sop to give a little certainty to the real estate industry, who was convinced that once landmark designation was unleashed on the streets of New York, that all development would cease to happen. Now, granted, the city was not in particularly good state financially speaking at this time, having nothing whatsoever to do with landmarks preservation, having a lot to do with a lot of other things. But so this was a reason why there weren't as many designations in the beginning as you think there might have been, and this was one of the things that the community really pushed against. Kent Barwick, again, I'd mentioned him a few times, always would say that the Landmarks Law was the only law that the people of New York really wanted and asked for. That, probably the Pooper Scooper Law as well. So, the first president of HDC, whom I could find, there have been other people who've claimed that they were presidents of HDC before, sort of like Emperor Norton's, and that's okay by me, was Joe Rosenberg, who was then of Brooklyn Heights, who became the chair sometime around 1978, when the illustrious Mr. Barwick was chair of the Landmarks Commission. The second president was a certain Anthony C. Wood. I believe some people in this audience might know him as well, who became president around '83 and arranged for our incorporation with subsequent not-for-profit status. Actually, wonderfully, Laura Nove just actually corrected me, because I always got this wrong, and she was a staffer at the Municipal Art Society who was working and helped staff the HDC committee. So that was, we were thinking that was like 78, 79, 80 or so? 76, 77-ish. That's, we're gonna get to why I'm like waving my hand and kind of giving this I'm not really sure stuff really soon.
So another person after that was Blythe Merrill, who also helped staff the HDC through the mid-'80s. Eric Allison became our president in 1990 and helped bring us into the professional organization we are today. In 1992, May 18th to be exact, you see, as we get closer to the present day, our records get slightly better. HDC hired Franny Eberhardt, our first executive director. Ms. Eberhardt has joined us, so obviously we must be doing something right that she hasn't run frightened from us. And we moved into the very modern shared workspace with Landmark West at 45 West 67th Street, which was a very, very chic basement space, if people remember. We were very much ahead of our time. In June of 1997, I was hired as the second full-time paid employee, which promptly stunted the organization forever. Now, I'm laying this all down as a basic skeleton for our chronology and armature, if I was going to be architectural about it, because it's hard to put flesh on the bones, and sorry to admit, especially because of our partners, NIPAP, that our written records are scant at best. Between volunteer record keepers, a lack of space, a few moves, and a cataclysmic flood in our storage space, which is a designated landmark building in Alphabet City, by the way, internal documents are wanting, especially for our earlier years. Our visual archive is not much better, given that pre-digital media is not as easily transferable and portable as digital media, and more importantly, preservationists have a propensity to take many, many more pictures of old buildings than of people. Even when you date them, you're like, look, it's the architectural terracotta building from 1980. Look, it's the architectural terracotta building from 1982. Who took it? It might say, but there's no people in it. It's kind of wonderful, but lacks a certain visceral appeal. It's even hard to say exactly who was involved in the Historic Districts Council, so we're being especially small c Catholic in that regard and assume, unless told otherwise, that a person who was involved in the civic side of preservation from the neighborhood perspective at the time probably attended HDC committee meetings. I consulted with people from HDC at least once. That's a fair shot at it. I just this afternoon, for example, discovered that one of the people who's now involved in our Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee, Roland Lopez, was on the board of HDC from 1990 to 1992. We've been talking to Roland for a couple of years now. He hasn't mentioned this. But thankfully, there are some records. So sifting through the archives is an archaeological task. You don't really know what you're going to find exactly, and sometimes you have to interrogate the voids in order to tell a more complete story, which leads us to tonight's panel, how HDC came to be and why we needed to exist. So if we can't find primary source material yet, we were still searching, we thought it would be insensible to gather an oral history from people who were active in our world and who came into contact with us as we formed and matured, people who could bear witness, if you will. We're honored tonight to have three distinguished guests and friends who consented to share their remembrances of both HDC and the preservation world in general. Because our panelists have been active in the preservation community over a long span in a number of different roles, here they are in alphabetical order. Laurie Beckelman began her career at the Municipal Art Society in the early 1970s and then served as the president for the New York Landmarks Conservancy in the 1980s before being appointed as chair of the Landmarks Commission in 1990 under Mayor Dinkins. She's currently the associate director of The Shed, the premier art space at Hudson Yards. Frank Sanchez was an early staff member at the LPC, serving from 1969 to 1971 after coming out of the very first classes at the Columbia University graduate program in preservation, before going into private architectural practice. He returned to the Landmarks Commission in 1978, eventually serving as executive director until 1986 under Gene Norman. He subsequently worked at the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Municipal Art Society before becoming head of the Americas Program for the World Monuments Fund in 2010. Anthony Tung served as a commissioner on the Landmarks Commission from 1978 to 1988 under Mayor Edward Koch. He has taught architectural history and international urban preservation at the Columbia University Graduate School for Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I believe some people here in the audience might be familiar with that small organization. the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MIT and the New School. He's lectured in Amsterdam, Athens, Edinburgh, Havana, Istanbul, Kyoto, and many, many other places, and across North America, consulting on conservation policy with officials in Toronto, Halifax, New York, New Orleans, and Cuba. We're very, very pleased to have us all here with us. So, thinking back on, let's just sort of cast our mind. We had, I'm now going to turn this off. The slideshow had been some of the initial historic districts that were designated in the 1970s, things that people at HDC were involved with. You can start thinking back to the 1970s. I can only talk about the South Brooklyn and Yugoslav version of it, which were filled with large dogs. But you know, you had things like the Beatles, you had Nixon, you had Vietnam, and in New York, you had John Lindsay. You also had sort of the bankruptcy of the time, but a lot of energy that was coming out of the political foment and the civil rights legislations that had been coming out on the national level, which really empowered, as it's always been told to me, has empowered the notion of heritage conservation. To everyone, who were some of the people involved in the civics, in the civic world, in the early days of the Landmarks Commission, or in the in the late 60s and the 70s, and how did that sort of interact with the coalescing of the professional preservation world? You know, part of the Landmarks Commission has always been a very big give and take with public policy. So who's the public? Anyone?
I'm not old enough to answer that.
I am.
I can start. I was Kent Barwick's assistant when Kent had already started the Historic Districts Council. And I'll never forget, for the first time, going into some of the most incredible brownstones in the village, because they would meet in the evening and I was the staff. I'm the one as an assistant, a full-time assistant me, and a part-time person that worked with me who was an actress who had a part-time job and working with me, and Kent, that was the Municipal Art Society. And we would go to see Ruth Wittenberg. I don't know if any of you remember that name, and Verna Small. And you would remember this, Christabel. And it was quite, and I was 23 years old, and Kent would say, well, just take notes and come back. I didn't know anything. But what I did know is, I knew the village very well because I wanted to be an actress when I was very young, and I spent all my time there. So I knew the streets very, very well. But it was at a time also, I can't remember, when was the library converted? Remember it was a prison?
That was in 60.
Talking about the Jefferson Market.
Jefferson Market.
Yeah.
And
Giorgio Cavallari was
Yeah.
Giorgio
63, 64
Cavallari was always
predate.
there too, Giorgio, and also talking about the public theater. But there were a number of and remember, this was still really the beginning of the Landmarks Commission. And when I went to work for Kent, it was that, they had signed into place that there was no longer a moratorium. So everyone was getting ready to start bringing things forward. And I recall so vividly, and going to Brooklyn Heights as well, to places that I had never been to Brooklyn Heights before, or going to Bedford-Stuyvesant, where the Municipal Art Society was going to, they would have their annual meeting and giving out awards, and to these historic districts that I'd never seen. And what I realized so quickly is that none of this would ever happen if it wasn't for these street fighters in each one of these neighborhoods. No matter how great the Municipal Art Society was, and Kent would say, you're gonna meet so-and-so, they're a lot older than you, but they've done a lot more than you have in your life. And just remember, you have so much to learn from them. And each one of them had a story. My regret is that I never wrote about any of them. And I'm sure a lot of them, unfortunately for Tony and the archives, many of them I hope were. But I do remember this so vividly. And all of these meetings related to historic districts were held at night. And I'm not saying that people were working all the time, but it was just this very, very, very small committed group of people. and mostly women. And I also recall very vividly Bill Shopson being very involved.
Now, Frank, you were in the first or second class of the Columbia graduate program?
Just about. And I was thinking about the commission when I went there. So I started in April '69, fresh out of Columbia, immediately before the Greenwich Village District was designated. That was right then. And
And a few months before the Stonewall riots.
a few months before the Stonewall riots. And it just seems like a different world. The commission was at 305 Broadway, and it couldn't have had 20 people working there, and they were all historians. And they had all done a great deal of research to create the original districts, and I think I might have been the first person they actually hired who had formal training in historic preservation. Because I had gotten out of the Columbia program like in February, and it must have been hard to get young people to go into the field because Harman Goldstone, who was chairman, actually came to my thesis presentation at the invitation of Jim Fitch, and then shortly thereafter offered me a job, which I took. And even back then, the field was not paying well. I had to take a drop in pay because I was working for an architect during my senior year at Columbia, and I had to take like a $2,000 a year cut to go to work for the Landmarks Commission. But I knew that's what I wanted to do, so I did it. So it was very strange. I must have been 26. I was by far the youngest person there. And whenever you want me to, I can talk about some of the design aspects of the place then, because I think they've changed very much.
I think that's an interesting question, which is, you were the only person who was a trained architect on the staff at that point?
Trained preservationist.
Trained
Yeah,
preservationist.
maybe, no, but because Harman was a
Okay, but he was the chairman. He was the chairman.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who was on the board, and I can't.
And they were, because Harman was also a part-time chair, right?
Yes.
Gene was the first full-time
Yeah,
chair.
I think that's
But
an
then-
important thing too.
But you want to be careful about that in terms of understanding, because Kent was working 60 hours or 70 hours a week.
Right,
He was being paid for less than that, but he was probably one of the hardest working chairs there ever was.
I think that's it. But the city had not put the investment, had not put the resources into saying that this was a full-time commissionership.
Right.
So that's, kind of an important thing. So
But there would have been 3 members of the Landmarks Commission who were architects, because that's required by
That's
statute.
required.
So there were 2 others there as well.
Was Jeffrey Platt on the national commission?
He had-
He must have been.
He might have been, yeah.
yeah, he was.
So anyway, I thought that I would write down 3 things that I remembered that happened shortly after I got there. So one of them, the one that sits in my head because I kind of got adopted as a young kid by Ruth and Verna and Regina Keller and George Ether, all those people, this 26-year-old kid goes to work there, and they all kind of huddled around me to train me, kind of. So that is the thing that stands out the most. While I was there, the commission approved Ulrich Franzen's Watchtower building in Brooklyn Heights, which was a big deal. They approved Hugh Hardy's building on 11th Street. And also,
Which was very, both
Weeksville,
of them very controversial.
it was, and Weeksville got discovered, and I met Joan Maynard for the first time. And those things stand out because the commission then was not diverse at all. And there were community people coming in, but they were all sort of well-heeled because they lived in Greenwich Village or they lived in Brooklyn Heights or some of the other fancy historic districts. And when Joan came in, she was like, for me, from a different planet. And I was so interested in what, she was trying to do and successfully did in getting the Hunterfly Road houses designated within like a year after they were discovered. Because they were only discovered in 1968, and by 1970 they were designated. So I was fascinated by that, but I was, you know how you are when you get out of college and you think you know everything? So I arrived at the commission. They immediately started giving me projects to approve certificates of no, things, to work on certificates of appropriateness. And most of them were on commercial buildings in the historic districts. So my first job was to work on storefront conversions, like on 8th Street. And at the time, I don't know if you remember, but that was the height of bronze anodized aluminum storefront.
This was in
Insertions.
Frank, this was in your, the storefronts on 8th Street was in your second go-around with the commission, because you and I worked together on designing and creating guidelines for the storefronts on 8th Street.
We worked on making storefronts on Madison Avenue.
8th Street.
Well, that was the second generation, because I can distinctly remember standing there and telling Ruth Rippenberg, oh no.
By this point, about 97.
Well, she was still walking.
And she remembered she was.
You can't put something in there that's in any way could be confused with a historic building. It's got to be this aluminum crap. I didn't say that. That you should put in because it's immediately distinguishable. And I remember people like Edie Haynes, who was on the commission there, looking at it and saying, wow.
Edie Haynes was also on the board of the Municipal Art Society.
Well, she got, so if you don't know her, she was a commissioner for quite a while.
Quite a while.
And very interested in federal period buildings. And so the idea of an aluminum storefront wasn't just killer. But the commission did approve some things like that, and Harmon felt very strongly that buildings should not, new buildings in historic districts should not have any or minimal historic illusion, although they should be contextual. And that's why they approved the Watchtower building, which is, look at it, it's about this building.
And at the same time, wasn't there also this controversial project that Rick Franzen had worked on in Brooklyn Heights?
Yes, that's it. That's the Watchtower.
No, then there's a series of townhouses.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
That's the same one. Oh, is that what it was?
So the townhouses were connected to the new building, and then the huge controversy about Hugh Horty's building on 11th Street. Right, but doesn't that seem like a million years ago?
It seems like a million years ago. It does. Well, I didn't realize that. Okay, that was lunch. I thought that was separate.
So were community groups at that point, were they concerned about, were they showing up to public hearings saying you can't put this in, you can put this in for a new storefront? What are you doing? Why are you replacing these windows in this way? I'm trying to sort of get a sense of where the preservationists who had been asking for protection for the neighbors, what they imagined protection meant. Because you were still making this all up. Formulating it, forgive me.
So my experience on the commission comes with Frank's second go-around at the commission. And when Ken asked me to join the commission, I didn't know there was a landmarks law. He called up one day and said there are 3 hack architects in Staten Island. They're recommended by the Democratic Club.
Is that what you said?
Yeah. And he said, we need someone who will actually be a credible person. And he knew I was a graduate of the Cooper Union School of Architecture. I had a professional degree in architecture, but my major focus when I was a student was urbanism. So he called me up and said, will you do this? And I said, sure, I'll put my name. Then he called up one day and said, I've arranged for there to be interviews of all the candidates, and it's tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you're going to go and be interviewed at the AIA with all the candidates. So I said, well, it would be nice if you sent me a copy of the landmarks law. And he said, I'm really glad you asked. The messenger is on the ferry right now. I was in Staten Island. So I stayed up and I read it. Next morning I went to the interview, and they asked me, what should be the standard for design regulation in historic districts? And I'm reading the law, and I said, well, I imagine the standard for new design for any construction in a historic district is the quality of architecture that surrounds it. I recall this answer because looking back now, after having traveled, been a commissioner and then traveled around the world and studied this across the world, I see that as a really good answer. It was fundamental. But when I got to the commission, it was hesitant to regulate design. And particularly, it was the period of schlock architecture. And
What year is this?
1979. The applications that were coming before the commission were just dreadful. The architecture of the city was dreadful. One of the things that happens during the time I was on the commission was Mayor Koch lifted the city out of bankruptcy. I don't know if you remember in early 1980s, 1970s, the streets were filled with garbage. If you look at old photographs, the curbs and sidewalks, so there's graffiti on all the subway trains and inside the subway trains. And many of the historic districts were simply falling apart. And when you look at those photographs, the other thing you see is the absolute cacophony of shop fronts and signage and all of the stuff going on at street level. It's absolutely wild what was happening. That was just standard practice in the city of New York. That's the way it was. It was the period of schlock. There weren't contextual architectural design didn't really exist at that point. So during the time I was on the commission, the city evolved from that, and I have some notes from when I was a commissioner. The amount of new construction we regulated in my first year on the commission was less than 200 million. It was probably like 175 million. My final year on the commission, it was 900 million. It was closing in $9 billion. So what had happened is the recovery had worked. The streets started to clean properly. And there was a building boom. So during the time I was a commissioner, I reviewed 2,500 applications for new construction. And I made almost 1,000 of those motions. Because what happened when I got on the commission was I got fascinated with the whole question of the regulation of architecture. It's something I studied as part of my studies at Cooper Union. But I didn't know what I was doing. And I was 33 or 34. And after a couple of sessions, I was introduced. Ken said, you need to meet Ruth Wittenberg. She was in a wheelchair by then, and Vernon Small was always where Ruth Wittenberg was because she was wheeling it. So I went up to Ruth Wittenberg, and she was down below, and she grabbed hold of my hand and pulled me towards her, holding it like iron. And she said, I've been watching you. You have the makings of a competent commissioner. And I was upset with that. I thought I'd graduate from this really great architectural school. As an undergraduate in architecture school, I designed a building that won an AIA award when I was still a student. I thought I knew what I was doing. I'd studied with several professors who would go on to be shortlisted for the Pritzker Prize, and some of my classmates were have been shortlisted or won the Pritzker Prize. So I really, and so I thought, well, that's an obnoxious lady. I didn't know anything. I didn't know who anyone was. Then, as the first year unfolded in regulation, I kept on looking at these schlock designs coming forward. So, in the beginning of the time when I was doing this, we were reviewing probably about 200 applications for new construction in historic districts. We eventually ended up reviewing about 400 a year. So maybe a little bit more. Over the time I was there, I said 2,500 applications in all. So this dreadful stuff was coming forward. I was unprepared for it. It was just the architecture of the borough. And I'd been studying the architecture of the elite, that small fraction of 1% of 1% of 1% of people who were designing this great stuff, and I must be besieged with this really crummy stuff. And I started noticing that while we were approving this stuff, Verna and Ruth Burdenberg were coming up and offering a searing testimony about how this was so awful. And so I was about a year into this, and when you're first appointed a commissioner and someone comes up and says to you, "Hello, Commissioner Tung," you go, "Well, I mean, it's really potent. It's a big deal. You start thinking a lot of yourself." So I started sitting there, and I was serving with Bill Conklin, who designed the rest of the new plan, and with Elliot Walensky was the other AIA guy to New York. Yes.
I'm gonna interrupt the monologue for a moment, just to because this is terrific, but I actually want to touch on a lot of things I think that you're probably going to bring up.
Okay, because what I was going to go to was how I realized that the preservationists were holding a higher standard, and that we had to change. And so I was going to explain how that happened. But
all right. Well, we will. I promise.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, the question, and you set this up wonderfully, which is how, as it matured, and Laurie, you joined you were the president of the Conservancy.
Yes.
1980.
80 till 90.
Right. So you were sort of on the professional civic side of this.
Right.
And this is while Frank and Tony, we were both on the regulatory side. What was going on in the civic world? I mean, what was informing?
Well,
Our
as I recall, there I went from being an advocate working for Kent, and Kent really did give me the most incredible training to have no fear, seriously have no fear. And since I also grew up during the Vietnam War, my parents made me believe that I could really do anything and really be in the streets and protest. And if I did get arrested, they promised that they would bail me out and get a lawyer. And seriously, and Kent understood this. I mean, and he was, and as you all know him quite well, those in the audience, why the Municipal Art Society at that time was so brilliant is that he took no prisoners. And he had people like Fred Papert and Tim Prentice and others, and I'm sure I forget, who knew why they were there. It was about a livable city. People weren't caring if they had a place at the table. They didn't care that it was, I'm not saying it was very, very social, but it was people that were on the board really were engaged in making a real difference. And as they founded the Landmarks Conservancy, and Carol was Carol Clark, an integral part of the Conservancy, and also had that boldness, which I think unfortunately a lot of groups, and these groups no longer have that, unfortunately. Maybe it's for many reasons, and we're not here to discuss that, but I think for me was you had all of the expertise and the capability I had none, but I also knew that I wanted to get something done, and I was given this privilege to go be head of the commission. And one of the reasons I think I had a very good, I've never told you this, but I think I had a really good interview, and I wasn't sure I wanted to work for the city. I didn't understand enough about the commission. I was an advocate, is that you were working with a group of people and you were very critical of the commission. And I used that as my Bible going in and said, this was not done by me, but this is what I would follow. And I also, when I mentioned on the phone the other day, Mayor Dinkins, who I really didn't know, I had met him before, and Barbara Fife was his deputy mayor, who I knew, asked me why I wanted to do this. And the real estate board was concerned, which is such an advocate, and I said, no, I'm more of a judge, I'll balance. But I remember saying to him, I said, if I become the commissioner, your commissioner, I'm not, many of the people that live on the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side, they didn't vote for you. So why don't we look at places, the people that voted for you, that look like you, and other people that will want to get more engaged. And it's a way of getting, it's grassroots. I mean, it's so obvious. I learned that from Kent. That didn't come from me. And that's what we did while I was there. We spent much more time in the other boroughs, except then you had people like Arlene Simon and others that were able to do great things on the Upper West Side, or whoever, Hal Brom in Tribeca. I mean, you had, again, each individuals, you know, Franny Eberhardt, what you were doing on the Upper East Side. There were so many different people that were, you know, we can pull, and many of them you are here today, that made it happen. Jackson Heights. When we went into Jackson Heights, there was incredible people from the commission on the staff that had already done all the work. They were the community. So in a way, I had a very easy job. I'm not saying, then you all of a sudden, also the government had changed. You no longer had a board of estimate when I got in. You had the city council, and these people were clueless. They were clueless, unfortunately. They were, I can't necessarily say they were hacks, but they had no idea what preservation meant. And I didn't have the expertise of the design part, but I knew, and it didn't matter. I also felt, I don't know what it looks like, but I know what's real. So to me, culture was very, very, very important. I don't know how you regulate it. I still think it's a big challenge. But I think I was there. And also, you talk about where the city was. It may not have been as dirty when you were there, but we were in a decline, as you know. So,
well, one of the things that you all brought up in our preliminary conversation was how the commission was, you know, in the beginning it was, you know, sort of 20 people in 305 Broadway doing their best and working seemingly pretty closely with the community. And then as after the Penn Central case and under Jean's leadership, and you know, when you were there, Frank, the second time we go around, Tony, it had become more professional and brought more expertise to the mix. But how did that mix with again, this sort of changing of, there's still a lot of people in the neighborhoods very concerned about their neighborhoods, very, you know, saying, you've got to do this, but meanwhile, you're getting more and more precedent. You're working on the Nascent Avenue guidelines. You're working on part 2 of the West 8th Street guidelines. I didn't even know there was a part 1. How did that interaction, you know, work out? When you were at, under Jean, the staff was up to 60 or 65.
Professional staff.
Professional staff, yeah.
It was 40 under Kent.
And that was the high
The
for
office
many,
of
many
the
years.
historian of the city of Havana is 1,000.
1,000.
Mm-hmm. Just thought I'd add that. My memory of this is that there was an adversarial relationship between the community groups and the commission. The commission would go to the community groups when it was time to get a designation, particularly a historic district. You couldn't get a historic district designated unless you had wide community support among the community. But when the groups were coming in and testifying on these design items and asking for a higher standard of design, the commission just wasn't responding to that. I was moving into this story, so there's 2 chapters to my story, and in terms of how I became more effective. I became a capable commissioner, as Ruth had predicted I might become. And it occurred in 2 stages. One stage was under Kent and one was under Jean. And under Kent, I explained how we were just voting out these ugly things. So at a certain point, when I saw the standards that the community groups were bringing were more fitting standards for a historic district, I cornered the other commissioners outside the hearing room, and I would say, Bill, why did you vote for that ugly thing? And he said, I know, it's impossible, but it's the culture of the city. Nothing better is coming forward. And so I talked to several of them, and they just said that's the way it is, particularly the professional architects. Now, one person on the commission, I should say there were two, but one of the people on the commission who really wasn't supportive of the idea of just let's rubber stamp the hack stuff was Elliot Walensky. So Elliot, if you don't know, had written the AIA Guide to New York City, and it's 999 pages long, and it has 4,000 entries. So there's a lot of crummy architecture in that book, or mediocre. So he really had an eye from top to bottom. So Elliot and I became allies, and as soon as we started campaigning for this in the give and take of public discussion at the commission, Ken immediately latched on, and so did the other commissioners. They were sort of like ready to be released into this. And the whole thing turned around. And so I served for about 4 years under Kent. In the second 2 years, the regulation turned around. And Kent asked me to work with Frank on guidelines for 8th Street. Maybe it was the second time around.
Why don't I remember that?
Frank, I have a copy of our draft guidelines at home. Right. So I have a copy of it. So we started moving in that direction, and it was really stimulated by the testimony of the HDC. Now I'm going to come to a second time, and I won't do it all as one talk, because the second time is really a hands-on story of how Jack Taylor and Christabel and Peg Moore and Helena Rosenthal and Ed Kirkland and Arlene Simon and Bob Kornfeld and Jeffrey Kressler started doing a dance with us, where they would come in and testify for a higher standard, and that would make it possible for Elliot and I to move the commission, because what had happened was when Gene became chair, Gene was an architect, and he brought in 2 new architects. So architects don't like to regulate other architects. They don't like it in New York. They don't like it anywhere. It's the same problem in Amsterdam, Paris, same problem. So when the new people came on, Elliot and I, we had gone from being able to move the whole regulatory policy to losing every vote. It was 6-2, 7-2, 8-2, 9-2. Every vote after vote after vote for a year. And so we would walk home after these hearings and talk about resigning. It was just so terrible to be in that situation. And then HDC saved us. So you want me to stop there and we can go on?
How did you save them?
Probably magic. You set that up beautifully, Tony.
So something had happened.
I don't remember any of this.
You weren't there.
He's making it up.
So the groups had always been testifying, but I guess this was a new generation of groups. And Christabel was central here. So this is a story about Christabel and her yellow pad. So Christabel started coming to all the hearings and executive sessions, as she does, and taking thorough notes, as she still does, only now on a computer. She was doing it on a yellow pad. I was sitting there with losing votes, and I started noticing that my fellow commissioners were looking at Christabel's yellow pad. They're going. And after an evening or two, I realized there was something about this, being held accountable, that was uncomfortable. So she had testified on an item, and I suddenly got the brilliant idea, I'm going to make a motion to turn this down on the basis of her testimony. And she comes from the neighborhood. So I did. And it was about a year into Gene's term, and we won the vote. It was unanimous. I sat back. I was stunned what had happened. And then I looked across the table at Elliot, and I hoped he had understood what had happened. And indeed, about 5 items later, someone else from the community had testified It was another person from HDC, and he made a motion and referred to them, and we won again. So we walked out of the commission that night, and I said, what's happening? And you know, of course, the commissioners were becoming sensitive to the fact that there was a better way to go, but I think there was also a political pressure. It was just people showing up and writing down what they were doing. What gradually happened then over that next period was more and more people from HDC started coming. Christabel, you and Jack and all the various people, they were talking with one another, and they were probably saying things like, we want to vote. And they quoted from us. And I know Frank had gone and had an interview. You don't remember, this isn't writing again. It's an interview he gave to Village Views where he suggested to the community groups that they learn the language of design regulation by the commission. And so that's what they, in fact, did. And Elliot and I were sitting there hoping they would come in and make the higher bar. And from that period on, for the next 4 years of Gene's term, I served with him for about 5 years, there was a study done of the commission by the Mayor's Committee on Appointments, the Abrams Committee. Yeah. And the study was that during Gene's time, I made 51% of all the motions for the commission. Elliot made 25%. So between the two of us, we were making 75, 76% of all the motions for a reason. Dorothy wanted me to make as many motions as possible because she said, let Tony make as many motions as possible because they'll stand up in court. But I was doing it for a totally different reason.
She had a yellow pad too.
And she had, Dorothy's yellow pad was even more nightmarish. But Ellie and I were making motions because if you see you have a consensus on an item and you're the one that makes the motion, you can inch it a little bit further down the design road. So that's why we were making so many motions. Mm-hmm. But it was this relationship. I think it's just absolutely true that if HDC hadn't been sending people from not just HDC, but you were sending people who lived in the neighborhoods, who were the head of the groups in those neighborhoods. If that hadn't been the case, I would have resigned from the commission, and Elliot would have also. It was just become too dreadful. But then I want to say something about Gene. Gene was, he's a great gentleman, and when he chaired meetings, if you differed with him, he gave you as much of the floor as anyone else. So when this started swinging around, and David Todd started voting with us, and even Francis Halsman, Gene did too. And so we went from not being able to win votes to having a majority for most of this. And Gene's commission, because we were informed by the public testimony, but also because of another thing. We were making motions extemporaneously. We were doing it all throughout Kent's tenure, and because the staff couldn't make motions for us because we were constantly changing policy. So they would give them a motion, but we rarely would use it. During Gene's time, we were making motions, almost all of them were extemporaneous, because then they could reflect what people said. So our motions reflected the testimony from the public hearings.
It's like you're speaking Old Welsh to me. That's
Because it's such a different time
Yeah.
from me, not that many years later.
Yeah.
My
Talk
time
about
is
that.
entirely different. So that you really gave us a very strong foundation, a basis to do what we were able to do as commissioners, but we had a phenomenal staff. So that the staff did amazing work. We looked so good as public officials because of the staff work and because of the testimony of Municipal Art Society, other groups, but the Historic District, Landmarks Conservancy, but the Historic Districts Council was phenomenal. at all times. Not that we always agreed,
Right.
but it would also, quote, stand up in court, because, I mean, Dorothy was our counsel, our leader, and at the same time, the commission was at a totally different place. Then I had no idea what you were talking about. I understand a little Welsh, but so I understand what you were saying. But, and all kidding aside, is that I had no idea that you were creating testimony that was being turned down constantly, that the design guidelines, because by the time I was there, everything really was in place. And also, which I would really be interested to hear you both talk about, because I was working for Margo Wellington at the time when the Upper East Side district. So you had Madison Avenue guidelines, and you were also changing zoning. So it was a time when city planning was complementing, or you hoped would be complementing, what the Landmarks Commission was doing. And by the time I got there, we didn't do any, there was very little of that.
Well, the Landmarks Commission always got stuck doing what all the other agencies should be doing, because they didn't do it.
True.
So everything got piled on landmarks to
But you
decide
did
it
it.
out.
But you did it.
Well, we tried, but I was thinking as you were talking and thinking how little I remember about what Tony was talking about. But at the beginning, in 69 and 70 and 71, there was a huge amount of work to do, but there wasn't much of a staff to do it. But, you know, there were so many districts to be identified and surveyed and written about and designated. And then they were learning at the same time how to function as a commission and how to regulate.
And so was that Beverly Moss-Spat?
That was Harmon, and then Beverly Moss-Spat, that's right, who was a planner.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was a huge amount of a huge amount of advancement between 1965 and 1990 when you came on. I mean, it was just a completely different thing in terms of
thank you.
who the staff was, you know, how the place was operated. But I don't know if it was in my second round there. There was none of the guideline stuff in 1969. In 1978, and those years following that, is when all that came. And I was always asked to work on them and develop them. And it was mostly so that the public would allow places to be designated. I mean, that was the big battle with the Upper East Side that I remember, is everybody was worried about Madison Avenue, get all tied up with regulation. So I created a guideline for the storefronts of Madison Avenue, which was, you know, fairly, not being a genius, it was just, well, just protect the historic fabric. Don't worry about the stuff that's going to change every 5 minutes, because it's going to change every 5 minutes. Anyway, you can always change it again. So just let it go and don't suffer with that. Protect the historic fabric. That was the essence of that. And we also did the same thing for the theaters.
That's right.
I wrote the guidelines for the regulation of the interiors of theaters, which was mostly because Jerry Schoenfeld was terrified
May
of
he rest in
designation.
peace.
He was blocking going ahead and designating theaters. And
That was a big
Can I
legal
just say
fight,
something?
too.
Until he
That was
died,
huge.
until Jerry died, I would have breakfast with him. Once in a while lunch, and I'd say, I can only handle 50 minutes. Because by the end of the time that we're having our breakfast, you are your face is red, you're telling me and screaming at me in a public space how the Yankees get more, and this team gets more, and he's the theater owner, and look what he gives to the theater, and how the guidelines don't work. And I'd say, you can do anything in your theaters. And
you could do anything.
We
Well,
would
you could
fight
reverse it.
every single time. We'd have the same conversation by the end. He said, let's have dinner. I said, I never had dinner with him. I could not handle it.
That is
Seriously,
so-
he was beside himself, ballistic.
But ultimately, he agreed to have them designated. So
He felt he had no choice.
After
And he
the
did
city
try
gave him
to,
the air rights transfer.
that's the only reason. That is the only reason. And he also tried to go to the Supreme Court, as if you recall, and
Yeah.
it was
He
rejected.
got defeated on,
He was- right.
he didn't get past the state.
That's right.
And the theaters bring up a really interesting thing, which is there's the evolution of landmark designation between the protection, the surveying, the identifying of historically important places, or rather architecturally important places, and then the other section of it, the historic section, the cultural section, which, as Frank said, appeared as hunter-fly houses and other things, but there's always been a struggle and of how the Landmarks Commission can appropriately designate and protect sites of cultural and historic
that
importance.
might have appeared with the Hunterfly Row houses, but that was like a unique thing, I believe. I think the
But it shouldn't
commission-
have been.
But it
over the
was. I
years.
mean, the commission continued to be focused on architecture, regulating architecture up
I mean,
until
look
pretty
at,
recently.
well, we did the Dvorak house, but then it was overturned
Yeah.
Right.
by the city
But as you
council.
say, I don't know how you regulate these things that are not about architecture. I think that's still a big issue. But
But there are things that
It
people
hasn't
want.
come on
I
to
mean, it's well, I mean, people have always talked
well, but
about
that's
it.
going
The Dvorak House was
to
done
that's going to
too.
change the
Right.
face, I think, of what is designated in the city, because I wonder how much there is left to designate that isn't
Well,
coming from
let
somewhere
me
else.
let me use
like
the example
culture.
of the Ladies Mile Historic District, which I remember at the time was empty mostly.
Most of those buildings were.
Those were big old white elephants, on Lower 6th Avenue that were, you didn't go there unless you were going to Apex Tech. And, but yet the advocates were pushing for it and they, you were all involved
Very.
in that. And what did that look like from the other side? How did you convince the city to designate this commercial area?
What year was that?
Ladies Mile was designated right after I left the commission.
So what year was that?
It was officially designated in 88.
88? 88?
88 or 89? 89?
I left the commission in
Okay.
88.
80, that's right, 89, because Jack wanted to do it for
So
2019.
it was an issue when I was still on the commission. I don't see this through the same prism that you do.
Strange.
First of all, I think, as my students at MIT said when talking about preservation theory, this isn't rocket science. And I said, no, it's incredibly simple, except when you try to apply it in reality. So I think all of this is politicized. And I think HDC has been a very successful organization solely based on one thing, to the degree you get political and you get rough. And when you do that, you have much more impact on the process. We designated, Gene stopped designation. So during Kent's term, the time I was on the commission with him, he was designating at the rate of 4,000
Yeah.
properties per year.
But not as individual designations, in the district.
That's including districts. I'm counting,
Yeah.
so it was 4,000 properties per year. Gene was designating at the rate of 220 properties per year. Why was that happening? He had the same staff.
And the
Exact same
mayor was
staff.
still Koch.
The mayor was still Koch, but there was a different deputy mayor.
Who was that?
And it was
Esnard?
Robert
Bob
Esnard.
Esnard, oh,
I don't know this for sure.
you remember?
I'm going to tell you something that I sort of know, but
Remember you're being recorded?
We're waiting.
yeah. I think there is a great possibility that there was a message given to Gene Norman to not designate. And that was not by the mayor. It was coming from a deputy mayor. And then, several years later, when Christabel published in Village Views her study of the decline of designations, it made the front page of the B section of the New York Times, David Dunlop writing about it. And I believe the chairman was called into City Hall and told by the mayor, "What are you doing?" And one of the deputy mayors said, "Yeah, what are you doing?" And it was all political. But again, the point of this is, what turned it all around? Advocacy. Right? That's what turned it around. The other thing we're talking about, you're talking about how the commission changed. Well, that evolution is pretty much the same evolution that occurred in Amsterdam and Paris and other places in the world. Historic district regulation is a product of the last 25 years of the 20th century. Paris's law is in 1974, so is London's. They were doing historic preservation since the late 1800s. But when I was studying this, what I looked for was the moment that the laws became binding. New York had a binding law from day one. There's something about the people who wrote the landmarks law. They had an insight into this that was just an absolutely incredible, far-sighted insight, and they knew to make it binding. Once the laws became binding in these other places, when I went and visited them, I would walk with experts and see the buildings that had been approved, the new infill buildings. Well, the evolution was the same as in New York. Ours had been a very personalized fight. It was Elliot and I and Gene fighting for this, and with Christabel, with all the people from HDC. I see it as this personal struggle. We were fighting against the forces of real estate. But in reality, what was happening was, in historic districts around the world, once the protection became stringent, gradually the architecture got better for two reasons. One is because all those commissions realized it's really dumb when we approve an ugly building in a historic district because it's going to be there for 40 years, right? So everyone comes to that realization. Something else happens. Contextualism in architecture occurs. And so I don't know if I mentioned this already because we've been talking about this, but one of the first courses at Columbia to teach, instruct their architects about contextual architecture was the professors were Charles Platt and Bill Conklin after they left the commission, right? And so contextual architecture emerged. And when I got back from first going to Paris, and I remarked to the people at UNESCO that I was really surprised that the infill architecture in Paris wasn't any better than the infill architecture in New York, which is like, you can imagine, French don't take that lightly. So a year later, the head of the architecture, one of the architecture schools from Paris came and he said, I just wanted to respond to what you said, because at that very moment there was a movement amongst the architecture schools in Paris. We decided we had to teach contextual architecture because it was embarrassing, the low bar of contextual architecture. So the world was changing, but in historic preservation, what was causing it to change? Why were all the universities suddenly studying contextual architecture? Because there were preservation laws that had become stringent all across the country. New Orleans wasn't that stringent until after Penn Central. Same with Charleston. The New York law created the possibility of a commission with binding powers. And what it did was, once it got upheld at the Supreme Court, it allowed all these other places that started in the game earlier than us to get stringent. They could do it too. And it caused a nationwide evolution. It's the same evolution that occurred in Europe.
That's a really good point. I'm going to pass it over to Laurie and Frank, if you want to sort of add anything before I open up for some questions.
I actually want to hear from the public.
Okay.
I don't know, Frank, how do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I want to hear from the public too, but I'd like to hear one thing which has always interested me about where the commission is heading and where,
I mean, now.
well, not just the commission, but where we're headed in historic preservation now after the first 50, 60 years of it. I've always been of the opinion that at some point, designation is pretty much going to stop because there's nothing else to designate. You've already figured out in a given city what is worthy of protection. You've researched it, you've designated it, except for new things that come along, like cultural designations.
Yeah, I think the cultural will be
Logic
more
would
important.
suggest that there's some endpoint and that it then shifts to protecting what you have designated, except for new things that are coming online because they're reaching
30 years old.
30
Sure,
years
or
old. So that will always be a constant feed. But generally speaking, I always thought that you keep working until you got to some point, and then you'd more or less stop. But I'd love to know how other people feel about that. And the other thing is, to go to Tony's thing about the design gets better, I wonder about that, because I think good design does not come from a committee. And I think in many ways, the job of the commission is to protect the historic resource and not spend so much time trying to make a better design, especially in the case of a new building. As long as you control the scale and you control the basic material, I've always felt it stifling, and I've always been concerned that because of that, you'll never get an excellent new building.
Let's
take away that
let's set
opportunity.
new construction aside, because that's its own thing.
So, but that's
You
a
know.
regulatory thing.
Yeah.
So those, I've thought a lot about that.
But going back to, I don't think you're going to have to lose any sleep over many things that, ours, have we designated enough? You can still look around the city, put Manhattan aside for a minute, but if you look around the city, let's look at Queens for a minute. The idea that Forest Hills Gardens is not designated is an outrage. And it's because the people that live there, the community, believe that they can do what they want to do with what they have, and they are the guiding force and the bigger whatever from the heavens. They know better than anyone. That is an outrage. And there are many other places like that in the city of New York. So
But there's got to
we
be,
will still have
I
our...
just keep thinking of a number.
Well,
So-
I mean, when Beverly Spat got the $1 million from the federal government back in '77 to do the first sort of comprehensive surveys of the city and come up with a historic preservation plan for the city, it was suggested then that that the best minds thought about 5%
Right.
of the city should be
Ultimately.
designated. They said
That's
5%,
right.
50,000 buildings, and they understood
be
that
it.
they would be losing some along the way and gaining some as they came online. And we're only at 30, and we're now, jeepers, 45 years later, and we're still at 35,000. So that's, I mean, that's just
There's a
numbers.
Yeah, the numbers, there's a little factor that gets involved with this. When those first surveys were done, it was about 4% was going to be designated. But there were 1 million properties in the city of New York at that time. So now when you look at the statistics now, what has happened is there's been a huge pattern across the city of joining zoning lots to make larger buildings. And so there aren't 1 million properties, it's about 800,000 properties. So although more has been designated, the way it reads as a percentage is different because you're always reading it against the number
But
of
getting back to
properties.
what even Laurie suggested, the notion that there is no Lower East Side Historic District
I was good.
and that there's a landmarks law is kind of insane. It's the Lower East Side. There needs to be some level of protection for some elements of the Lower East Side.
So can
What
we-
those elements are and how you protect it, I'm not sure.
So can we hear
Yes.
questions, maybe?
Lynn?
Excuse me, can I just ask you to speak into the microphone and we'll record it? Thank you.
Very good point, what you brought up.
So I just read in some legal documents, affidavit from the current or the previous chair a few 6 months or so ago, and also from some testimony that the LPC chair gave to the hearing. I understand that there's a process called the Rfp process. So I wanted to get your take on how process and bureaucracy has changed through time, under different commissioners. So the process that they describe in the affidavits is that the chair and the legal counsel and some staff sit and look at the pile of RFEs and put them in a yes, no, maybe pile. There's no public record, there's no recording, there's no criteria, there's no guidelines, there's nothing. They just do that, and that is as it is. And then thus the pipeline of RFPs is then created to go to the full commission. Now, I interviewed a retired staffer who said, oh, well, there used to be a kind of committee of the commission who would kind of do that a little bit or participate in that, and there was a lot of discussion. But that seems to have disappeared. So how did it used to be?
It was wonderful when we had the committee. We would,
All of us had a committee.
and we hear all these requests from those of you out there, and the staff, which had gotten to be quite excellent. I don't remember this evolution of the staff so much. Landmark staff to me always seemed to be really well, very knowledgeable and were throughout my tenure. I always thought that was the case. And especially the older people, because they had been, they were the revolutionaries. They were people who had come to the Landmarks Commission after it had first been created, when it was a revolution in governance in the United States. And they had passion that was absolutely wonderful. I think it was really bad for the commission when as they gradually retired, and it didn't have those people. But what you're talking about, Len, is just bad governance. It's nothing more than that. It's just why in a democracy would we not have open consideration of this? And it's just bad governance. But it was wonderful when it was open discussion and this was worked out by the commissioners talking with one another. But there was always a problem, and the problem was a legal one.
Yes.
And that was if you were to say that a certain building wasn't going to be designated that year, that it was totally valuable, but you weren't going to designate it that year in terms of the things that were endangered, then 3 years later, a developer would come along, and this in fact happened with the Cody Rizzoli building, and said, the commission turned this down.
It's also even more than that, which is with the open meetings law. Any meeting of commissioners then became access to Freedom of Information Act. There was a concern, perhaps overly cautious or perhaps not, because there are many examples. Laurie can talk about the Wilkie building and stuff like that, where developers or owners heard people talking about a landmark building. We lost the Frank Lloyd Wright showroom for that reason, the American caustic tile building as well, during the East Midtown rezoning. Once they heard about it, they would strip. They'd preemptively strip the facade or demolish it or pull demo permits. And so that was, and in fact, HDC did a legal action in the early 2000s saying you have rejected certain things based on a request for evaluation committee, and the committee was then officially disbanded forever. And you can't prove a negative in government. Like, you can't prove that there isn't one. If they say there isn't one, it's one of those things that has been a problem.
There are other things to be done.
Yeah.
For one of the things I always thought would be a good idea for the Landmarks Commission was to have a yearly public hearing on potential designations and just take public testimony all day about potential designations.
And that's what happened with the backlog thing. It was not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination, but we did actually force, with the help of legal counsel and with a lot of political support from Gail Brewer and
But
Ben
not
Kalos.
legal counsel from the commission.
Not legal counsel of the commission. No, it was against legal counsel of the commission. That, to create a system where we actually spent a lot of time visiting, and our colleagues at the Landmarks Conservancy and people from Staten Island came out and testified, and we ended up designating, the commission ended up designating 30% of the 95 buildings that were left on the backlog, which is, I think, a dubious response, but it was a better response than what had originally been proposed.
I think the success of HDC and the success of this law in New York can be measured against 20 or 30 years of terrible landmarks administration by the city. And it's just been some of it has been almost anti-landmarks administration, and yet the historic districts have continued to grow more beautiful with time. And so I think it's an absolutely wonderful testament to this group, to your efforts, and to the strength of the law.
Thank you. We're burning daylight, so Peter, you had your hand up, or Tom, back there?
Hi, Tom Spath from Cobble Hill. I moved there in '69. I think around '75 I joined Community Board 6. We had a land use committee, and I believe subsequently we had a landmarks specialized committee on matters that were that the community wanted to bring before the commission. And we got testimony from interested parties in the neighborhood. I testified against and for things that I knew about. I guess I had to recuse myself as a committee voting member, but in any event, my question to you is, how valuable in your retrospective views was the fact that the community boards had a responsibility, and maybe some didn't respond to that or take it up, but CB6 was hugely active, I would say, on all landmark issues.
Well, I have an opinion which I know is not going to be popular, and I know that I really respect people that serve and the amount of quality time that you spend on it. And I've appeared before the commission, before community boards forever, when I was at the Municipal Art Society, where I was running the Landmarks Conservancy, and then in other projects where I was trying to build some controversial things or not. And I found that many of the people were not, again, when you talk about people that were informed, you're informed, you were engaged, but many of the people that were on these committees from the community board were not informed. And so that, yes, when I was at the head of the commission, we obviously carefully read everything, but I, after a while, felt comfortable turning down what the community board was saying, because I felt a lot of it was not in my backyard, as opposed to, is this appropriate or not, because it's a landmark. And I'm sorry to say this to you, because I know you've worked extraordinarily. Your effort has been remarkable, but the times that I've seen, it's more of, I don't want this because, but had nothing to do with what our criteria was. I don't know if you felt differently. Sorry.
We've got time for one more. Peter?
Yeah, I'm Peter Bray. I'm the chair of the Historic District Committee in Park Slope. I can only hope that we're going to hit a day where everything that's worthy of being landmarked in New York City is landmarked, but it seems like that is so far in the future, I can't even imagine that day. I know that in Brooklyn, just to give you an example, in Park Slope, the commission has designated about 2,800 buildings, perhaps.
In the district, as districts.
Yeah, when I talk about the original district and two extensions.
Right.
Expansion.
And the neighborhood has on the order of maybe 7,000 buildings, and there are easily 2,000 or 3,000 other buildings that are worthy of being landmarked that haven't yet. And we know that this process is going to take many, many years. And of course, as is true in, I think, neighborhoods across New York City, we see the erosion of the integrity of our neighborhoods taking place every single day. So to me, the big issue is when we deal with the Landmarks Commission, we're always told, one, that our priorities are neighborhoods that have not had any landmarking activity. I wonder whether all those neighborhoods have an active set of, used the term street fighters before, who are doing that advocacy, because the LPC isn't taking any initiative to initiate the process of landmarking in neighborhoods. But the other thing that they keep saying is that we have limited resources. And what I'm wondering is when is anybody going to confront the city council, the mayor, and say that the LPC ought to be 2 or 3 times bigger than it is now, so that it can do the landmarking that neighborhoods across the city are demanding that it do. You know, even if part of this may be a kind of a NIMBY response to development of the community, I think that any reasonable person would say that there's a vast number of buildings left in our neighborhoods that need to be landmarked, and that the LPC is not doing its job, and that the city council is completely letting us down.
Well, you know, if I may say,
Please.
can I say something?
No, go ahead.
No, but it's each one of us that has run the commission, we spent countless hours begging the city council, begging the mayor, anyone that you possibly can to get more money. And at the same time, I know that I think it was Barbara Lee Diamondstein I think it was Adele Chatfield Taylor that ran the first Landmarks Preservation Foundation. So we had money.
And then Barbara Lee.
Yeah, and then Barbara Lee, but to do all the work that we didn't have the money on staff, and many people were very upset that we were doing that. And my feeling was, you want to get more done? You want to do this? This is how it's going to be. And at the same time, and I know you're going to think this is funny, and I really tried this, and it did not work, but I did try it. You could even ask him, Bill Bratton, when he was head of the police department under Giuliani. I had no idea how long I was going to stay. I stayed for less than a year. And I remember taking Bill Bratton through the Landmarks Fund Commission when we had the old precinct, old slip. And I said, you know, and he said, how did you get this building? You know, this should be part of the police commission, police department. I said, well, actually, the Landmarks Commission should be under the police. And he said, why? Why? I said, because these are valuable buildings with valuable people. Not everybody's rich, and they need to be protected. And if we're under the police department, we will have all these things will go up in value through the whole city. You should take us on. And I was serious. He thought it was insane. But he really did try to get the building, and he eventually got the building, and they turned it into the foundation. But, and all kidding aside, I also went to the fire department. I really kept thinking that if we were in a place that we're still so small, less than 100 people, it would figure out a way, people were trying to merge us with city planning or buildings. That was not right. You had to have somebody else that needed to protect us. I was not being funny. Ask Stephen Raphael, he thought, that's not a bad idea. But anyway, we never had enough money. And the commission, I have to believe that the chairman whoever it is fighting for their people. I can't speak for every single, I know that Jennifer Rabb was a major fighter, and she got a lot more money than I did, even with Giuliani.
It's true. Thank you all very much for coming out. We are continuing. This is a year-long process. Our next big event is going to be on Saturday, March 6th at our annual conference. Actually, Landmarks Chair Sarah Carroll, 7th. You see, it's the gin in here. Saturday, March 7th, thank you. Our keynote is going to be Landmarks Chair Sarah Carroll has agreed to be the keynote, so that should be fun and interesting. So thank you all. Thank you all for your support, and please give the panelists a hand.